So, Vanessa, in 2020, I published a book about 5 minutes before the world shut down called Decoding Boys. And it was all about why boys go quiet and how we can help raise them despite that and love them and nurture them. And I'm not going to lie, I thought it was a pretty good book until I read Boy Mom, which
It
is an
was a
amazing.
very good book. Your book
It
is
was
wonderful. It's
it was a
very
good book,
different than Boy Mom.
but Boy Mom levels up like nothing. This book is just it's really a love letter to boys mixed with so much rich science and data and information. And the author, Ruth Whippman, is here today telling us about, yes, about the book, but really about her journey and her knowledge and how she landed where she landed and started to write about boys in this way.
So, Ruth Whippman is an essayist, an author, a cultural critic. She's originally from London, but lives in the US. And you'll hear she's got a lovely, mellifluous British accent, which will make this episode even more wonderful. And her book, Boy Mom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity, is a very profound, very multifaceted look at what is happening for boys in this country. And it is also very personal because she's raising three boys of her own. And I think this episode goes places we haven't yet gone. It touches on a variety of things we've discussed in other episodes, but it really goes deep on how is our culture messaging and raising and caring for boys. So I think you will find this meaningful, interesting, and enriching. Enjoy. Hi, Ruth. It's
Hi.
so great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So there's so much to cover. For those listeners who've listened to us for a long time, know that we love talking about teenage boys. We love teenage boys. We believe in teenage boys. We want the boys in our lives to be cared for and to have rich, deep emotional lives where they are seen as full human beings with all of the trappings of what that means. And so having Ruth here is particularly wonderful because she too wants the world to see teenage boys in a new light. And Ruth, can you start us off? You're not just a renowned journalist and essayist and writer about culture, but you are also the mom of three boys.
I am, yes.
Talk to us about the inspiration for Boy Mom and like what was the impetus that got you going on this trajectory?
Yeah, so I have three boys, as you said. The last one, my final one, was born just at the time when it was possibly like the worst time to be giving birth to a son ever, because it was when the Me Too movement was just exploding online. And it was like a year into the Trump presidency. And the conversation around boys and men was very much framed in terms of like toxic masculinity and harm and like all the terrible things that boys and men had done. And it was a really conflicted moment for me. You know, I was full of all these like really angsty pregnancy hormones. I already had two boys. I was exhausted. And, you know, I was quite conflicted. I think as a feminist, I was like, great, women are finally speaking up and we're holding all these terrible men to account. And, you know, we finally have a voice. But then there was this sort of mother part of me that was like, oh yeah, but what, but. And it was just this very conflicted feeling and just this sort of almost defensive feeling about, well, you know, this is such a negative conversation. What will it do to this generation of boys to grow up hearing this, you know, hearing their sort of sexuality and their, you know, whole beings kind of described in this way. So I just really wanted to dig into all of it. Like, where are we going wrong in the way that we're socializing boys? Because obviously we're having some quite, you know, systemically bad outcomes. And, you know, and also what does it mean to grow up as a boy in the shadow of this cultural conversation?
And you do this with the most magnificent storytelling because really you could take Vanessa on as who throws themselves under the bus with more vim and vigor. I mean, every story is about your humanity and your own lens. You're not telling the world you're terrible at this and I know better. What you are saying to the world is, I'm a participant. I'm on the same escalator, people mover as you are. And I'm just trying to figure it out along with you, which is the gift of your perspective here. And
thank you.
Makes it very fun to read. You start at the beginning. You talk about data around around brain development at birth. You talk about socialization from day one. You talk about, I won't describe how babies are described in the hospital because I think it could get me canceled, but let's just say there's a lot of gendering that happens in the neonatal intensive care unit in terms of who does well and who doesn't do well. And let's just say that the boys don't do as well as the girls in the intensive care unit when they're born super early. And there's data around all of this. Can you start there with sort of the nurturing piece and how different we are with our sons and our daughters and why this is the place that you begin your story?
Yeah, so I think that what I found out that really surprised me is that there's this real disconnect between the nature and the nurture pieces. Like we sort of tie ourselves in knots trying to talk about sex differences and, who's good at reading maps and who's good at reading emotions and all of this. But, and this kind of, well, boys will be boys and they're just born like that. But what really shocked me actually that really stands out in the research is that not just that boys are not these kind of like tough, resilient, rough-tufty kind of creatures at birth, but they're actually more vulnerable and fragile than girls. And that's both physically and emotionally. So boys are born, and I found out, this from the work of Alan Shaw, who's a, neuroscientist and a psychologist at UCLA. But boys are born with their right brain. So that's the part that, broadly speaking, deals with like emotions, relationships, attachment. That part of the brain is about a month behind a baby girl's brain in development at birth. So it's immature compared with a baby girl's brain. And because it's immature, it's more vulnerable to harm. So, we see that pretty much every neurodisability, every sort of poor outcome is more common in boys than it is in girls. So they are more sensitive, more fragile, and they're kind of, in a way, harder to look after. And we're talking about averages, we're talking about group level differences. So they find it harder to calm down emotionally. They find it harder to regulate. They need their caregivers and their mothers, or, whoever their primary caregiver is, more than a same age baby girl who tends to be, on average, more resilient and more independent. But because of the way that we socialize boys, because of our sort of preconceived and often like unconscious feelings about who boys are and who they should be in the world, we often end up sort of giving them the exact opposite of what they need. So they really need like more caregiving, more nurture, more engagement with emotions, more help with all of these things. But because we see them as these kind of strong, robust, tough, masculine creatures, we end up giving them kind of less care in a way. We sort of handle baby boys differently on the whole. We roughhouse with them more. We jiggle them around. We throw them up in the air. We say like, hey there, little man, and sort of fist pump with little baby boys. Whereas we give girls this kind of very tender, kind of different, people use different voices. They use different vocabulary when they talk with girls and boys. And it starts on day one and it continues all the way through childhood and all the way through life, that we tend to engage with females, and girls more around their emotions. We talk to them using different language. We're more sort of tender and protective of them. And we see them as more vulnerable, and we don't see boys as vulnerable. And so this sort of becomes like a double whammy. Like they need more and they get less. And as a result, the gap just grows and grows.
Ruth, we're going to go into a variety of different subjects that you cover in the book. But for the people sitting and listening, people like me and you, apparently, who are like, oh my God, I did it all wrong. Like, I totally did that with my children. I'm doing that with my toddler. I'm doing that with my 8-year-old, my 12-year-old, Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which this is not all a fait accompli, that throughout the stages of a kid's development, there are new opportunities to kind of give them what they need at that point in time?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I really did not want to do, as you say, in this book is to like shame people and make them feel like this is all terrible, I've screwed up. Because this is something that I'm so prone to feeling myself. You know, I'm always just like, oh God, I'm terrible. I did the worst thing. And I think modern American parenting is really set up to make us feel that well. It's really set up to make us feel guilty, to make us feel terrible. And then it's all on us and it's all our fault. But really, all of this stuff, you know, I think we should see it more as an opportunity because at any age you can change this, you know, and, you know, at any age, any kind of intervention where we're sort of engaging with boys more about emotions, we're listening to their feelings more, has shown to make a really big difference. And what's really interesting is in the research is that these interventions that people do, whether they're in schools, whether they're in the home, actually make more of a difference with boys than they do with girls. Like they're so responsive to these kinds of inputs. And so anytime we can start even a little bit, it makes a huge difference.
I just keep thinking through this conversation about my kid's preschool director, who is this wonderful, wonderful educator. And when kids would fall down or bump into something or hurt themselves, especially when the parents were around, the thing you would hear from parents is, "You're okay." And she would ask the adults in the room to reframe it as a question, "Are you okay?" Because she didn't want kids to be told how they felt. And she also, and this was in her infinite wisdom, you know, this is 20 years ago, was so aware of the gender differences between the way that parents of boys and parents of girls would handle, you know, scrapes and bumps and bonks, right? And so often they would announce to their sons, "You're fine." And they wouldn't allow for that vulnerability. There was no space for it. And so it was her mantra in this preschool to say to the adults in the room, it is not a statement. It is a question. And I do believe that is the beginning of the path to erasing this lack of vulnerability in boys. And you can start on that path at any age. If you have never done that with your kid and they're 8 or 10 or 12, you could start now.
You know, it's really interesting that you tell that story because that thing about physical pain and like, you're okay, get up, you know, be a man. You know, they wouldn't often say like, be a man, but like that flavor of sort of like, be tough, you know, be strong, keep it all inside. Physical pain, that was one of the first things that a lot of the boys that I interviewed, because I interviewed many, many teenage boys about their experiences of masculinity and how they were raised. And the physical pain thing was something that came up so often that they were told to suck it up, that physical pain, that they had to like be strong, be tough. And it was like the first thing that they remembered when I asked them those kinds of questions. And it was all often like the way into talking about emotional pain, you know, because they, you know, it was so sort of on the surface that it's so definable. It's so easily definable. You fall, you hurt your knee, everyone's telling you, you're all right, get up, you know, be strong on the sports field, on, you know, in the playground, whatever. And so it teaches them a pattern of behavior that teaches them to suppress their emotional life as well.
That's right.
And it's, you know, it's all part of the same thing. But it was interesting that you mentioned the physical pain first, because it's such an obvious manifestation and it's such an easy thing that we can do.
And it's innocent, right? I mean, when my kids were little, when your kids were smaller, right? That you want to tell them they're okay in the world. And yet it blunts their own innate response and it becomes sort of it points the bow of their ship in a certain direction. And what I think you argue so effectively is you can just move the bow of the ship a little bit, and where that ship lands is so different.
I completely agree. I mean, it's these really small things. I mean, one of the examples that I talk about in the book, and it's not about physical pain, but I think it's the same sort of idea, is that, you know, when my youngest was going off to kindergarten. So the book kind of covers the time from when my youngest was born in the kind of whole Me Too nightmare to when he went to kindergarten at age 5. And on his first day of kindergarten, he's like super anxious. He's walking through the gates to into the school for the first time. He's got his giant backpack on his back and he's all little. And there's like there's this like male volunteer who's like helping the kids come in. And there's 2 little girls in front of him. And the volunteer says to the first girl, like, hi, sweetheart, in this sweet little voice. And then the second girl, like, hi, sweetheart. And then my son walks through and he's like, his voice like goes down like an entire octave. And he's like, hi, buddy. And like gives him a high five. And it's like, in that moment, we have communicated to my son that those two girls are like these vulnerable, innocent, sweet girls who need protection and who are probably anxious on their first day and who are scared, and they're going to look after them and nurture them. And they communicated to my son that he's the strong, masculine, tough guy who's, and it's such a minor thing. And it was so well meant and it was so sweet. And this guy is super kind. It's not some like idiot asshole. Sorry, am I allowed to say?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. This isn't some asshole that we're talking about. This is some like lovely guy who's working in a kindergarten, but he's just communicated this very subtly different message to the girls and the boys about what kinds of emotions it's okay to have.
So, Ruth, let's take that and sort of expand that messaging and look at, let's play it forward a little bit from your 5-year-old to your 12-year-old to your 15-year-old, right? And on and on. What is the messaging boys are getting? Because it's in some ways they're getting like two sides of a coin and it's very confusing. And what impact is that messaging having on them as people in friendships and relationships and families?
So I think what's going on in this particular cultural moment is that boys are getting quite contradictory messages. But it's almost like we never got rid of the old bad messages, but we've brought in a whole bunch of new ones and so boys don't really know how to be in the world. But in terms of the sort of masculinity norms, those are still very much in circulation for boys. All the boys I interviewed talked about this idea that they were expected to be strong, to be tough, not to show vulnerability, not to show weakness, especially with their male peers. That was with other men and other males or other boys, that they mustn't like let their guard down. That was a phrase that came up a lot with really different kinds of boys. Like never let your guard down and show any weakness or vulnerability, or you'll be kind of jumped on, that you will lose face and you'll be seen as a girl. And so they're still expected to kind of perform this masculinity. And that can like really have the effect of shutting boys down in talking about their emotions, in talking about their feelings, in making deep connections with other people, with deep friendships, because you can't really have a deep relationship with another person if you're not able to be vulnerable with them. And so that was something that really got in the way. But then in this new moment, I think they were also feeling this sort of other type of pressure, which is like more of a politicized thing, which is just like, men and boys, you've had your turn now. You're so privileged. You're so, you benefit from the patriarchy. Time for you to shut up and everyone else to have a chance, which I think is in some ways like makes sense. And we need to give a voice to other groups, of course, and people of other genders. But I think what ends up happening is boys start feeling kind of shut down from both sides. It's like, all the old prohibitions are still there. And there's all these new ones where they have to be quiet from, for political reasons. And I think they're just like, I don't know how to be. I don't know how to express myself. I can't say anything.
And you talk about loneliness in particular. Yeah. Can we go there for a second? I mean, the Surgeon General of the United States has been on a campaign for now a couple of years trying to shine a light on the loneliness epidemic in this country. And it begins in childhood, and it sounds like it begins in male childhood.
Yes. So I think that, as we've heard from the Surgeon General, like people in this country are feeling lonelier in general, but I think there's some very specific ways in which this problem is worse for boys, and it's has got a particular flavor in boys, which is really, really damaging. And so you see it in all kinds of data. So there's like a way in which teenage boys at the moment are becoming more isolated, like materially more isolated. They're spending more time on screens. They're replacing real life social time with screen time in a way that actually girls are really not doing quite as much. Girls are on screens a lot, but they're still managing to fit in quite a lot of social time. But boys are spending more time on screens and they are spending less time socializing in person. And I think a lot of those like male social spaces are kind of migrating online to like these big video games or platforms like Discord and all the rest of it. So I think there is like growing isolation. But also when I talked to the boys in interviews, like the theme of loneliness came up all the time. And some of the boys that I talked to were kind of pretty isolated. And some of them really had a lot of friends and buddies. It wasn't that they were on their own, but they really felt that they couldn't be vulnerable with them. They couldn't share personal stuff. These guys, they sort of had to be on guard all the time. And so it wasn't a very kind of intimate or deep relationship. And the guys were really telling me that this was something they missed. They wanted, it wasn't like, oh, that's just the way we are. That's the way we like it. They were like, no, we want these deeper connections, but we don't know how to do it.
Ruth, did any of your research or conversations turn up ways for them to sort of bypass the messages of masculinity towards kind of intimate friendships or deeper connection? Like, had anyone sort of figured out how to manage those? Yeah.
Yeah, so there were actually some really sort of sweet and lovely examples of that happening. That one pair of friends that I interviewed. So it was I interviewed the one guy, and he was saying that he'd always seen his friendships as like competitive, and he couldn't be vulnerable, he couldn't be personal. It was really keeping him from forming these deeper connections. He was lonely, all the classic things. And then he'd become so depressed and so lonely that he'd gone to therapy, and his therapist had actually kind of helped him be more open and be more vulnerable. And by the time he'd learned those skills in therapy, when he went to college, he was with his roommate who'd had a very similar upbringing, very similar experience. And he actually was the one who went to this other guy and just like reached out and said, it's okay, and suggested the other guy went to therapy. The other guy had panic attacks. The friend like supported him through it. And it was like, these guys had not been taught, they had not been socialized in how to do this kind of work. Girls are very naturally socialized in all of these skills. They see it everywhere. They see it in role models. They see it in books. They see it in stories. They know how to do this work, and boys really don't. And they're figuring it out on their own. And it's hard. You have to be really brave to do it. There are costs to it. And so it's really hard when people say, do you just say to a teenage boy, well, yes, go and be vulnerable to, just to try it? And the consequences could be really bad. So it's like, it's not simple, And I think they have to be, they have to have a lot of courage to do it. And I think the more we can have these conversations, the more we can help boys in their skills, the more that we can normalize it, the better.
Well, and then you layer on things like body image, which you talk a bit about.
Yes.
And so, just to paint a picture, I don't want to be a huge Debbie Downer, and the book is not at all a Debbie Downer book. It's a laugh out loud, funny, very smart, science-based book that talks about very heavy topics. But let's take your classic, 14-year-old boy who was raised in the United States and at this particular juncture and has been socialized not to be vulnerable and not to express his feelings and to have bro culture with his friends. And then he's living in a body that's shifting and changing, and he's conflicted about how he feels about it. And now he's on social media, or any media for that matter, it doesn't have to be social media, is telling him you need to look one specific way. You need to look jacked. You need to look ripped. This is the masculine ideal. And so now he develops a body image complex, which may or may not turn into an eating disorder of some sort. Yeah. And he has never been socialized to be vulnerable with anyone, and he's never been able to talk to them. So we press pause, and now here's the question. How do parents who are raising these kids, how do trusted adults who care about these kids, coaches and mentors and educators, how do they begin a conversation with a kid whose entire life has been steeped in no conversation about any of this, and the weights are just getting heavier and heavier?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think you're right. I think this is one of the things, the body image question is something that has really changed in modern teenage life for boys. I think this is something that we focused on very heavily for girls. And, certainly in my adolescent years, and, it was this terrible kind of culture for girls and women in terms of having a perfect body. And I think those pressures have just ramped up for boys just exponentially. And it is so hard. And how do we open conversations with boys about these things? I think the key thing, and I know you guys talk about this a lot as well, is to listen, to really listen to their experience. I think my experience of talking to teenage boys is that they want to be heard. They're ready to talk and they want to be heard, and they feel that nobody is listening to them. And I think it's just about trying to get them to share their experience and not to lecture them and say, don't do this and this. I think especially, in this kind of masculinity space, there's quite a lot of moralizing that comes from parents. And I think it comes from a good place. And I do this myself. It comes from this place of fear. You see these like Andrew Tate type figures or these like masculinity guides, and you're like, that's terrible. And, he's a misogynist and da, 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 da. And then I think boys just feel so shut down because there's a reason why, they're primed to receive this message. They're not pulling this out of nowhere that society values these things. It's like there's a reason why they're drawn to these things. And so it's, I think that the tone needs to be listening, not shaming, empathetic, really curiosity about their experience and their understanding. Just be curious about what is your actual experience. What really surprised me when I interviewed all these teenage boys, I had expected, when I started this journey of like, I've got to interview however many teenage boys, I was like, oh God, this is going to be a nightmare. They're not going to want to talk at all. They're going to be monosyllabic. And what I found was that they just wanted to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And they were so open and they were just desperate for someone to listen to them. So I think that's the key.
Ruth, what does it sound like when you are interviewing a teen boy and something comes out of their mouth and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm sitting here and I'm nodding and I'm listening to this, but I'm like dying a little bit inside, whether they say something about like what their body should look like or who they're, you talk about visiting a facility in Utah about guys who are sort of recovering their masculinity after setbacks. And they say all sorts of things and their families say all sorts of things. So when you hear that and you're like, okay, be empathetic, don't judge, keep them talking, what does that sound like coming out of your mouth?
That's a great question. And look, I think it is obviously, different when it's your own child than when you're a journalist who's like going around and interviewing people for a book. Those are two very different things. And it's not as emotionally loaded. Although having said that, it is quite emotionally loaded talking to teenage boys when you're a mom of of nearly teenage boys and you're like, oh God, this could be my son. One thing that I would say is that we have done as a society a lot of listening to male opinions. Like our society values men's opinions on things very highly. And we do not do a lot of listening to men's feelings or boys' men's feelings. And so what happens is boys get the message that their opinions are extremely important and valuable to everybody and that their feelings are of no value and that they shouldn't be sharing them. And this idea is built up and built up and built up. And what I found, because I interviewed people who had all kinds of like really toxic opinions, misogynistic people, incels, masculinity guys, all the rest of it. If I could try and listen to the feelings that were driving those opinions and like engage with them on an emotional level rather than like taking what they were saying at face value. So if they're like, women are terrible, to come back and be like, well, women are great, or women are not terrible, or how dare you say that, or, you're keeping the discussion exactly where they want it to be. And you are just engaging on this level that's never really going to get you anywhere. So I think for me, what I was trying to do was to just hear where they were emotionally. And once I started listening in that way and like approaching them in that way and seeing them as people who have real genuine pain and suffering and not these kind of toxic whatevers, then the opinions kind of crumbled a little bit. It would just actually be that they would start to engage on a more emotionally honest level as well.
Yeah. You tell the story of a young man who, and I want to talk about incels and sort of the Andrew Tates of the world and the online culture it feels very both mysterious and terrifying to people caring for teens and young men. But you tell the story about an incel who is very aggressively misogynistic. And then he starts to share what his childhood was like and how he had been bullied for years and years and years and made to feel ugly and disgusting. And you sort of are able to uncover what's going on underneath it. And as frightening as it is to hear someone's opinions about, an entire gender, I did start to feel empathy for this poor kid who was deeply unhappy.
Yeah. And what was really interesting about talking to him, so I went pretty deep with two different incels in the book. And one of them was actually really not misogynistic. His views were like pretty, he didn't really have a lot of terrible views, but the other guy really did. I mean, he had all these awful views about women, but they were very clearly a defense. He hated himself. As you say, he'd been bullied, he'd been shamed. And like a lot of the things that were going on for him in his childhood and in his family life and the expectations from his parents, they were kind of extreme versions, but like not that different conceptually from what a lot of boys go through. It was this pressure to be so masculine, to never show weakness with his dad. He said he was more like his mom and he was like tender-hearted, but he'd been continually shamed for that. He felt like this constant sense of shame about not living up to this masculine ideal that had been fed to him in the culture. And that kind of shame, I think it's actually relatively common in boys. So this was a very extreme example of it. But what I was finding when I was talking to these guys was actually, they weren't these like total fringe freaks who had all these like crazy ideas that were nothing like anybody else. They were coming from a very similar place to a lot of boys. It's just they were a much, much more extreme version of it.
It's funny for you to describe, you started from this place of basically saying, oh my God, it could be my kid as you're heading into these interviews. And, given what we do for a living, we have this feeling a lot, which is we sit on both sides of the seesaw. Oh my God, this could be my kid, or no way, this would never be my kid.
Never be my kid, right? Yeah.
And neither extreme is healthy or helpful, right? Because really, so many times what you describe, and in this section of the book, it's no exception. You describe just an exaggerated description, exaggerated circumstance.
Yes.
But there is a little sliver of this that we can see, whether it's in people in our own family or people in our community or people, with whom we work or with whom our kids go to school, because the culture and the socialization and the individual, they're not extricable at a certain point, right? I mean, we're living in this very entwined and globalized community. And so it's an amazing thing. I want to throw in one more political layer, which is and just to take the incel argument to the next step, which is about sort of the conservatism in the culture and what your thoughts on that, and where this sort of, you come at this book as a self-described feminist, and proudly so. Talk a little bit about those political threads and sort of how they impacted your conversations with kids and where you landed.
Yeah. So I think when I first started writing this book, and I think was kind of the case for many feminists in this time of Me Too and, this whole conversation about toxic masculinity, it was sort of almost, the framing was like, if you are on the progressive left, then you're basically on the side of girls and women. And if you're on the right, you're on the side of men and boys. And there's this sort of tribal aspect to it. And like when you hear someone talking about men's rights or the rights of boys, you just sort of think it's like this dog whistle that you're like, oh God, this is like some kind of right-wing nutcase, and it's, and I started to, and this is why I felt kind of defensive, because I was like, this can't be right. We all live in this world together. It can't be this zero-sum game where, you pick your politics and you pick a gender to empathize with, and then you can't have any empathy for the other one. And I think, if we fall into that zero-sum framing, then we're really playing into the hands of the people who I think, as a feminist, this idea that like, it's time to like punish men and punish boys for like the patriarchy and all of the abuse, I think that we're actually playing into the hands of the narrative of the right, which is just like feminism is the enemy and we're not on the same side and feminism is going to destroy men. And, actually what I found was that we're all trapped in the same system together. This system of patriarchy just harms all of us. It puts us all in these boxes, which are really unhealthy. It does not allow us to access our full humanity. It does not allow us to connect with each other and with ourselves. And that is, yes, men and boys benefit from these systems in some ways, but in other ways, they're really, really harmed by them, so it's complicated. And as I write in the book, I think that male socialization is this weird blend of like indulgence and neglect in a way. It's like we bring out in boys this sense of entitlement on the one hand, that they're entitled to all of this stuff. And on the other hand, this sense of like shame and inadequacy, and it all comes from the same system. We're all on the same side. I feel like we shouldn't be divided in that way.
So, Ruth, how do we talk to boys about it? Like, how do we? I mean, I have your sense of how we listen to them and how we kind of foster conversation, but we're entering a really, really complex, yet another really complex election cycle at a time when our country and our world are in a seemingly upheaval and on a global sense. And people are scared and uncertain. And, often when it, I don't know if this happens to you, but when I'm scared and uncertain, I end up talking more and I get on a bigger soapbox and I, am more fervent and more opinionated when really with our kids, that's probably like that we want to be even less so and listening more and less standing on our soapbox. So how do we get into these conversations with our kids in a really constructive, empowering way?
Yeah. So I'm exactly the same as you. I'm just like, the more scared I feel and the more horror I see when I look at the world, the more I'm like, oh my God, I start to panic and I'm like, it's all on me and I've got to socialize my boys out of that and I've got to tell them exactly what they think and patriarchy is terrible. And it means that they just shut down. They can't listen. So I think the first thing is to just check in with yourself and be like, okay, how am I going to have this conversation? Am I in a position where I can have this conversation empathetically and generously and to listen, before you start it, and not to probably have it in a moment of panic and fear. So like pick your moment where you are able to do it, because you can't in every moment, And I think also just assume, and I'm sort of, I feel like we shouldn't really have to say this, but I think it is really necessary to say, which is just assume that your son is a good person and is coming from a good place and wants to be an ally, wants to be on the side of good, wants to help build a better future. And we're not like pinpointing them as the enemy, because as soon as we start sort of saying, well, people like you exploit people like this, and this is, then it's like they feel defensive. So I think you want to get them on side by assuming that they want to do the right thing, which I think they do. I think for the most part, like all of the boys that I spoke, I guess I spoke to that one incel who did have those pretty awful views, but I think had he been approached with like care and empathy and to hear his part and his feelings, then I think he probably would have had far less of the defensive misogyny. So I think, assume the best in your child and listen. And, also some of the things, as I was reporting this book, I realized that these things are quite complicated. It's easy to be like, actually, it's simple and men have all the privileges and they benefit from everything. And the teenage boys won't feel that in their life. They won't be able to see that. It doesn't make sense to them at all. They'll be like, well, what is all this privilege that I'm supposed to have? All I hear is that I'm terrible and that, and they will experience it in a really different way. So I think we have to talk about the history, talk about all of the things, set this in context, but also be willing to listen to the very real problems that they will be having too.
And it feels like there isn't a clear dividing line between the nature and nurture of it all. There isn't really a blunt divider between socialization and genetics. And we know both contribute. There was a part of the book where I can't even remember what story you were telling. And as I was reading, I was flashing back to when I saw Star Wars with my kids for the first time. And they were probably 6 and 8, something like that. And my son, when it ended, said, that was amazing. That was an epic battle.
Yeah.
And my daughter said, I don't know what you're talking about. That was a love story.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. And it was, but they're raised in the same home with the same value system and the same lens and all that. And what about that was driven by the different chemicals in their brain when they were in the womb versus what about that was the way they were socialized. And by the way, both perspectives were right. That was what was most amazing about that. And that's where I think there's so much grace to be given to these boys is like, just because maybe our lens is a little bit different sometimes, and there's especially in the mother-son dynamic, it doesn't mean we are right and they are wrong. And what you do is you paint a picture of of examples of boys who have been led to believe they are wrong and where that goes. And so maybe that's a little bit of that conversation too, is, and I think Vanessa's hunger to understand the language when you're in interviews, I share it with her, like when they're telling you they have the shame, when they're telling you that they know they're getting the world wrong, how do you, as the journalist, the gift of not being their mother in that situation and just being the journalist, at what point do you just want to give them a hug and say, no, you weren't right? I mean, how did that go down?
I mean, a lot of these interviews were done on Zoom in the pandemic, so there wasn't
no hugging.
No hugging. Although I really did feel that I felt very tenderly towards these boys, and I had so much respect for them, and I was so impressed by how well they could articulate. And considering all of this socialization that really kind of pushes them against like really understanding and articulating emotions, they were actually really surprisingly good at it. And it was really hard. I mean, I tried to be quite neutral. I didn't want to be like, yes, you're right, it is terrible for, but sometimes if they shared something, I would often say, so many boys have told me the same thing. And that was really meaningful to them. And I would share that, like, everybody was saying the same, because I think what's really hard, what was interesting was when I saw boys in groups, and I talk about this in the book, there's this scene where I'm at this like boys therapy group, and like the whole thing, they're just like throwing insults at each other and like spitting out all these like memes, and they can't engage emotionally at all. But when I interviewed each one away from the group, they were very emotionally articulate. So I took pains to say to each one, if it was true, which it usually was, so many people have told me the same thing. I've heard this from 3 people this morning, and I think that made them feel safe, that it was really common what they were, because it's a lot to go out on a limb and say to a journalist. I mean, I think also there was a part that it was anonymous. And so, I changed everybody's name in the book, and they knew that. So they didn't feel like they were saying this publicly,
And I think I want to say people forget, but it's easy to lose sight of the fact that kids evolve and mature. And like the memes speak, which happens at my dinner table, where I'm like, I don't know, like there are words coming out of your mouth, but I don't know what any of them mean. I need you to define each of the phrases that was used. Like, it's ridiculous and funny, and sometimes it's rude and offensive, and you got to call them out on it. But also in a year or 2 or 5, the conversation sounds different, and you're like, oh, this is so amazing and fascinating and mature, and you're so interesting. And then all of a sudden they slip back into the old bullshit, and you're like, oh my God, it's back. But I mean, making room for them to evolve and change and become interested in stuff and engage in stuff. And we just had a conversation about, the mixed martial arts, the ultimate fighting stuff. And my husband and I are like, wait, why do you like it? Like, what is it that you like? And the temptation was to be like, it's appalling. I can't believe you watch it. Like, it's disgusting. But credit to my husband, who was like, what's fun about it? Like, what do you enjoy?
What appeals?
What appeals? And one of my kids was like, I just could never do it. Like, it's amazing for me to watch because I'm not capable of doing what they do. And I found it really... And all I can see is like the violence and the blood and the brain injuries. And like, that's all I can think about. And he was like, no, I just physically could never do it. And so I like to watch it. And it was apropos. I mean, I was also in the middle of reading your book, so it was particularly salient. So I think for people feeling like this is how my kid is now.
Yes.
This is forever. It's not forever. And you spoke to these kids, you've tracked these kids, we've raised our own boys. Like, there is a journey and an evolution and an opportunity for growth.
And I think, with boys, it all comes so loaded in this moment. It's like, we've got to fix everything now. And, everything's so terrible and the stakes are so high and the consequences could be so bad that I think you're absolutely right. We're not able to just be like, yes, take a breath. They're kids, they're maturing all the time. They're changing. They're trying things out. They're trying on new identities, and that's healthy. It's good that they go through these things, and that so I think you're absolutely right. Make patience. And even in the time that I've written this book, I mean, in the time since the book was finished and I've been, publicizing it, whatever, they've already changed a lot. My kids are in a really different space than they were even then. And so it's like, and I see my eldest who was, so anxious, and he had, quite a lot of struggles in different ways. And he's just gone by himself to London on a plane. He, he's 13 years old, nearly 14, but, he was staying with his grandma, my mom, and she told me that he had like walked to the train station by himself, bought him a ticket, got on a train to central London, bought some presents for his brothers, came back by himself, and I'm just like, this would have been inconceivable even 6 months ago. And he's a totally different kid, and I think it's holding out that hope, holding your nerve a little bit is so important.
And it would have been inconceivable if he had been a girl too.
Right.
And that's right. I mean,
totally.
some of this is so universal.
Yeah. It's nothing to do. Yeah. It's nothing to do with gender. And I think maybe we're more willing to give that grace to girls in this cultural moment. Maybe we don't have that same, I don't know. I don't have girls. So I'm sure there's many other types of panics that parents of girls have, but like maybe this one of
many.
Yeah, right. I'm sure. But it's like maybe not so much the one which is like, you're going to be a sex offender or a like incel or a
serial killer.
Yeah. It's maybe not that flavor of panic, but who knows? I don't know. Maybe it is.
Ruth, the book is so fascinating and so rich, and it's such a treat to get to talk to you about it and to be in conversation on a really beautiful, difficult, fraught topic, particularly in this moment. We so appreciate your coming and, first of all, writing this book, and also joining us and sharing all your thoughts with our audience. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been such a joy talking with you both. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.